In the spring of 1943, the fate of the Second World War hung by a thread stretched across 3,000 miles of ocean. German submarines prowled the Atlantic in unprecedented numbers, hunting in coordinated wolf packs that could mass 30 or 40 boats against a single convoy. The tonnage of Allied shipping going to the bottom exceeded anything yet seen in the war. March of that year became the darkest month of the entire conflict at sea. Allied losses reached 120 merchant ships, totaling 693,000 tons. The Allies managed to destroy only 15 submarines in return. Britain's official naval historian Captain Stephen Roskill would later write that the Germans never came so near to disrupting communications between the New World and the Old as in the first 20 days of March 1940. 3. Winston Churchill, who understood perhaps better than anyone that Britain could not survive without American supplies crossing the Atlantic, made a confession in his war memoirs that has echoed through history ever since. The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. Not the Luftwaffe raining bombs on London, not the threat of invasion during those desperate months of 1940, not the flying bombs and rockets that would later strike British cities. The submarines. The numbers justified his fear. Britain imported approximately 50 million tons of supplies annually: food, fuel, weapons, raw materials for factories producing tanks and aircraft, medicine, ammunition. Literally everything that kept the island nation fighting depended on merchant ships completing voyages that took them through waters where German submarines waited. If those supply lines could be severed, Britain would starve within weeks. The war in Europe would be lost before American soldiers ever set foot on the continent to challenge Nazi domination. The convoy system that protected these vital supplies represented one of the oldest principles of maritime warfare, proven effective since the age of sail. Merchant ships, sailing together with naval escorts, presented a smaller target than hundreds of independent vessels scattered across the ocean. A submarine could only attack what it found, and finding a convoy required luck or intelligence. Once found, the convoy offered protection that individual ships could never achieve. But convoys moved slowly, limited by their slowest vessel. Organization required time that delayed sailings. Loading and unloading concentrated in fewer ports created bottlenecks. And when submarines did find a convoy, the results could be devastating, with multiple ships lost in a single night. The debate between convoy advocates and those who favored independent sailing continued throughout the war, though experience consistently demonstrated that convoyed vessels survived at far higher rates. The men who sailed in these convoys faced conditions of extreme difficulty. Merchant mariners were civilians, many of them older men or those unfit for military service. They received relatively modest pay for work that exposed them to constant danger. When their ships were torpedoed, survivors often faced death from exposure in the frigid North Atlantic waters, where hypothermia killed within minutes. Those who made it to lifeboats might drift for days before rescue. Many were never rescued at all. Admiral Karl Doenitz commanded the German submarine fleet, and he believed with mathematical certainty that he could achieve exactly that outcome. He had developed his strategy across 2 decades, studying the lessons of the First World War and refining his concepts through endless theoretical analysis. The tonnage war, he called it. The concept was brutally simple in its logic. Sink Allied shipping faster than the Allies could build replacements. Maintain that rate long enough, and Britain must sue for peace. Maintain that rate long enough, and no American invasion of Europe could ever be mounted. The submarines would win the war by strangling the supply lines upon which everything else depended. Doenitz calculated that sinking 700,000 tons of Allied shipping per month would eventually exhaust British reserves and prevent any meaningful American military contribution to the European war. His submarines would accomplish what the surface fleet could not. They would defeat the Royal Navy, not by confronting its battleships and cruisers in conventional combat, but by making the ocean crossing too costly to sustain. In the early years of the war, his calculations appeared correct. During 1940, German U-boats sank over 2 million tons of Allied shipping, while losing 24 submarines. The exchange rate was catastrophically favorable to Germany. Submarine commanders became celebrities back home. Otto Kretschmer aboard U-99 sank 46 ships, totaling 273,000 tons, becoming the highest-scoring submarine ace of the war. Gwenthreprion had already achieved legendary status by penetrating the British fleet anchorage at Scapa Flow and sinking the battleship Royal Oak in October 1939. Joachim Schepke rivaled Kretschmer's record until both were lost on the same night in March 1941, demonstrating how quickly fortunes could reverse in submarine warfare. When America entered the war after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Doenitz saw an opportunity that exceeded even his optimistic projections. He launched Operation Drumbeat, sending his best commanders to hunt along the American East Coast, where defenses were virtually non-existent. Only 5 submarines could be spared for the initial operation, but Doenitz calculated that even this small force would achieve results far beyond anything possible in the heavily defended convoy routes around Britain. The results were devastating beyond German expectations. Commander Reinhard Hardigan took Uon 2-3 across the Atlantic and arrived off the American coast in January 1942. What he found astonished him. American coastal defenses proved worse than merely inadequate. They were almost completely absent. Cities refused to dim their lights, despite warnings that the glowing shoreline silhouetted merchant ships perfectly for submarine commanders hunting at night. Beach resorts continued their normal illumination. Ships sailed independently without escort, following predictable coastal routes that a child could have plotted. Hardigan navigated partly using a tourist pamphlet from the 1939 New York World's Fair because proper charts of American waters had not been distributed to U-boat commanders in time for the operation. It did not matter. The hunting was so easy that German submariners called this period the Second Happy Time, echoing their earlier success against British shipping before adequate defenses were organized. In those opening months of American involvement in the war, tankers and freighters burned within sight of resort beaches. Vacationers on the New Jersey shore watched distant explosions at night. The flames reflected off the water for miles. Bodies and debris washed ashore along the eastern seaboard from Maine to Florida. Lifeboats carrying survivors of torpedoed ships landed on beaches where sunbathers had been relaxing hours before. The war had come to American waters with shocking suddenness. Hardigan sank ship after ship, including the British steamer Cyclops on January 12, 1942. This 9,000-ton vessel became the first victim of Operation Drumbeat. 87 crew members died. Hardigan continued hunting until his torpedo supply was exhausted, then returned to Germany a hero decorated by Hitler himself. Other commanders followed his path, and soon a dozen or more submarines were operating along the American coast at any given time. From January through August of 1942, German submarines sank 609 ships, totaling more than 3 million tons in American and Caribbean waters. Only 22 U-boats were lost in return. The exchange rate was approximately 28 ships for every submarine destroyed. At this pace, Germany would win the war at sea within months. Doenitz's arithmetic seemed vindicated by every sinking. The Germans called American waters the American shooting season. Officers competed to add tonnage to their scores. The submarines operated with near impunity, surfacing at night to attack with deck guns when torpedoes ran low, confident that no effective opposition would interrupt them. Some commanders grew bold enough to shell shore installations, terrifying coastal communities who had believed the war was something happening far across the ocean. But Doenitz and his commanders had made a fundamental miscalculation that would eventually destroy everything they had built. They had measured American potential by American peacetime performance, and they had concluded that a nation that appeared soft, divided, and distracted could never mobilize quickly enough to matter. They were not alone in this assessment. Hitler himself dismissed America as a mongrel society, racially degenerate, and incapable of fighting a real war against hardened European powers. The entire German leadership looked at American industry producing automobiles and refrigerators and saw nothing that threatened the Third Reich. They could not have been more wrong. Their miscalculation about American industrial capacity would prove as fatal as any military defeat. The transformation began almost immediately after Pearl Harbor. American shipyards that had been building vessels at a leisurely peacetime pace suddenly accelerated to speeds that German planners considered physically impossible. Henry Kaiser, a construction magnate who had helped build the Hoover Dam and the Grand Coulee Dam, approached shipbuilding with methods borrowed from automobile assembly lines and massive civil engineering projects. He had never built a ship in his life before the war. Traditional shipbuilders scoffed at his ideas. Ships had always been constructed by skilled craftsmen working slowly and carefully over months or years. Naval architecture was an ancient profession with established methods. Kaiser ignored the skeptics and built his yards around prefabrication, standardization, and mass production on a scale never before attempted. The results stunned everyone, including Americans themselves. Kaiser's yards reduced the time required to build a Liberty ship from 230 days to 45 days, then to 30 days. Then lower still. Workers who had never seen a shipyard 6 months earlier were welding hull sections together with speed that seemed impossible. Kaiser recruited women, minorities, and workers from rural areas who had no maritime background whatsoever. He trained them quickly and put them to work. In November 1942, Kaiser's Richmond Yard No. 2 laid the keel of the Liberty ship Robert E. Peary as a demonstration of what American industry could accomplish. The entire ship was built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes from keel laying to launch. Workers operated around the clock in continuous shifts. Prefabricated sections arrived at the slipway, ready to be welded into place. The vessel splashed into the water before most conventional shipyards could have finished laying a single hull plate. This was not merely a publicity stunt. It was a demonstration of industrial capacity that should have terrified anyone paying attention in Berlin. If Americans could build a 10,000-ton cargo ship in less than 5 days, what else might they accomplish when fully mobilized? By 1943, American shipyards were producing vessels faster than German submarines could sink them. The United States Maritime Commission delivered 19 million tons of new shipping that year alone. This represented a 56-fold increase from the 341,000 tons produced in 1939. German analysts had projected American industrial expansion, but nothing in their calculations had prepared them for acceleration on this scale. Their pre-war estimates assumed American shipyards would take years to reach significant output. Instead, production exploded within months. The Liberty ship program eventually produced 2,710 vessels. These were not elegant ships. Critics called them ugly ducklings. Designers had deliberately simplified construction to enable mass production, sacrificing speed and efficiency for manufacturability. The ships were slow, making only 11 knots. They were built with welded rather than riveted hulls, a technique still considered experimental by conservative naval architects. Some broke apart in heavy seas, their welded seams cracking under stress. But they carried cargo, and they were built so quickly and in such numbers that U-boat successes became increasingly irrelevant to the overall balance. For every ship the submarines sank, American yards launched 3 more. The industrial response represented only half of the Allied answer to the U-boat threat. The other half came from technology and tactics that transformed the nature of undersea warfare itself. The submarines that had hunted with impunity would soon become the hunted. The most closely guarded secret of the entire war was Ultra, the British code-breaking operation centred at Bletchley Park, a Victorian estate northwest of London. German military communications were encrypted using the Enigma machine, an encoding device that the German High Command believed to be absolutely unbreakable. The mathematics supported this confidence absolutely. Enigma could be configured in approximately 159 million different ways. Testing every possibility by hand, even working around the clock with hundreds of clerks, would take longer than the age of the universe. But British codebreakers, led by brilliant mathematicians like Alan Turing, found ways to exploit German procedural weaknesses and develop electromechanical machines that could test thousands of configurations per hour. The capture of key materials from German submarines accelerated this work dramatically and repeatedly throughout the war. In May 1941, the destroyer Bulldog and other escorts of the 3rd Escort Group forced UN-10 to the surface during an attack on convoy OB-318. The submarine's captain ordered his crew to abandon ship without ensuring destruction of classified materials. Sub-Lieutenant David Balmet, just 20 years old, led a boarding party from Bulldog that descended into the damaged submarine. Working in near darkness with water rising around them, Balmet and his men recovered the submarine's Enigma machine, its rotors, and current cipher documents. The submarine remained afloat long enough for virtually everything of intelligence value to be removed before it finally sank. King George VI later called this the most important single event in the whole war at sea. The material from Yuan-10 helped Bletchley Park read German naval communications for months. Convoy routing improved dramatically as British intelligence tracked U-boat patrol lines. Losses dropped noticeably, but the advantage was temporary. In February 1942, the Germans added a fourth rotor to naval Enigma, creating a new cipher they called Triton. Allied intelligence called it Shark, and for nearly a year it remained impenetrable. During those dark months of the Second Happy Time, U-boats operated with virtual impunity because the Allies could not read their communications to anticipate their movements. The cryptographic blackout coincided with the worst period of the submarine campaign for the Allies. Without Ultra, convoys could not be routed away from patrol lines. Wolf packs formed and attacked with devastating effect. The coincidence of timing was not entirely accidental. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park had been reading German naval traffic with sufficient regularity to make a noticeable difference in shipping losses. When that capability vanished overnight, the impact was immediate and severe. The submarine tracking room at the Admiralty, led by Commander Roger Wynne, attempted to predict submarine movements using other intelligence sources and operational analysis. Wynne developed remarkable intuition about German tactics, but nothing could fully replace the direct access to enemy communications that Ultra had provided. During the Shark blackout, his predictions became educated guesses rather than informed assessments. The breakthrough came through another desperate act of courage. On October 30th, 1942, aircraft and warships forced U-559 to the surface in the eastern Mediterranean after hours of depth charging. As the submarine began to sink, Lieutenant Anthony Fasson and able seaman Colin Grazier stripped off their clothes and swam through oil-covered water to the sinking vessel. They descended into the flooding control room, working by feel in the darkness, and began passing documents up to Tommy Brown, a 16-year-old canteen assistant who had lied about his age to join the Navy. The submarine was sinking throughout this operation, water rising around the men inside. Fasson and Grazier retrieved codebooks crucial to breaking the four-rotor Enigma, the Wetterkurzschlüssel weather short signal book, and the Kurz-Signalheft short signal book. These materials proved essential for the cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park, but the two men went down with the submarine when it sank suddenly, trapped in the flooding compartments. Both received posthumous George Crosses for their sacrifice. Tommy Brown received the George Medal. He survived the war, only to die on February 13, 1945, while trying to rescue his youngest sister from a house fire at his family home in North Shields. The materials from U-559 allowed Bletchley Park to break the Shark cipher in December 1942. From that point forward, British intelligence could often read German submarine communications faster than the intended recipients. Convoys could be routed away from Wolfpack patrol lines. Hunter groups could be directed to submarine positions. The information advantage was decisive, though it had to be used carefully to prevent the Germans from suspecting that their codes had been broken. Technology multiplied the impact of intelligence and transformed every aspect of anti-submarine warfare. The most important single device was centimetric radar, which used wavelengths short enough to detect a submarine's conning tower on the surface at considerable distances. Earlier radar sets operated on longer wavelengths that German scientists had learned to detect using receivers called METOX. When a U-boat's METOX receiver detected radar emissions, the submarine could dive before aircraft reached attack position. This gave submarines a crucial advantage during surface operations. But the new ASV Mark III radar operated on a 10-centimeter wavelength, produced by a revolutionary device called the cavity magnetron. This wavelength was invisible to METOX receivers. German scientists did not even believe such short wavelengths could be used for practical radar. The British kept the technology intensely secret, and ASV Mark III became operational in March 1943. U-boat commanders suddenly found themselves under attack without warning. Aircraft appeared overhead before submarine lookouts detected anything. There was no advance warning, no time to dive, no explanation for why defenses that had worked for months now failed completely. The Bay of Biscay, which U-boats had to cross when leaving their French bases, became a killing ground. Submarines that had transited safely for years now faced constant danger. Complementing radar was the Leigh Light, an airborne searchlight of 22 million candela intensity that could illuminate a submarine at the final moment of attack. Squadron leader Humphrey de Verde Lee had invented the device to solve a specific problem. Radar could guide an aircraft close to a submarine at night, but the final attack required visual contact to ensure accuracy. The Leigh Light provided that capability. The combination proved deadly. An aircraft would approach on radar until close enough for the searchlight to catch the submarine in its beam, then attack with depth charges before the crew could react. The first Leigh Light kill occurred on July 6, 1942, when a Wellington bomber destroyed U-502 in the Bay of Biscay with all hands. High-frequency direction finding, called huff-duff by the sailors who operated it, gave convoys another crucial advantage. When U-boats communicated with headquarters to report positions or coordinate attacks, shore stations and shipborne receivers could triangulate their locations. Escort commanders learned to interpret these fixes and position their ships accordingly, sometimes racing to attack a submarine before it could close with the convoy. Approximately 24% of all U-boat losses during the war resulted from huff-duff information. Weapons improved alongside sensors. The standard depth charge had fundamental limitations. It sank slowly through the water and exploded at a preset depth, giving submarines time to maneuver away. More critically, attacking ships lost sonar contact during the final approach, creating a blind zone at the critical moment when accuracy mattered most. The Hedgehog mortar addressed this problem elegantly. It threw 24 small bombs ahead of the attacking ship in an elliptical pattern, while the ship still maintained sonar contact. The bombs detonated only on contact with a submarine, meaning a lack of explosion signaled a miss and allowed immediate re-attack without wasting time on unsuccessful patterns. Hedgehog proved roughly 10 times more effective than conventional depth charges. The Allies also closed the air gap that had sheltered U-boats in the mid-Atlantic. This 300-mile zone lay beyond the range of land-based aircraft from bases in Iceland, Britain, Canada, or Newfoundland. Submarines concentrated there, knowing they could operate without interference from the air. Pack attacks could be conducted on the surface with impunity. Closing the gap required very long-range aircraft, particularly B-24 Liberators modified with extra fuel tanks and reduced defensive armament. In February 1943, only 18 of these aircraft were available for Atlantic operations. The demand for heavy bombers to strike Germany competed with maritime patrol requirements, and the strategic bombing advocates held more influence. President Roosevelt intervened personally on March 18, 1943, ordering the transfer of 60 Liberators from Pacific operations to Atlantic patrol. Escort carriers also deployed to provide air cover where land-based aircraft could not reach. The escort carrier Bogue achieved its first U-boat kill on May 22, 1943. Air Marshal John Slessor, who took command of RAF Coastal Command on February 5, 1943, worked relentlessly to close the gap and coordinate air operations with naval forces. He fought bureaucratic battles for resources against Bomber Command, which wanted every available heavy aircraft for the strategic bombing campaign against Germany. Slessor argued convincingly that a Liberator patrolling the Atlantic saved more lives and shortened the war more effectively than the same aircraft dropping bombs on German cities. Eventually, he received the aircraft he needed. Admiral Max Horton, who had taken command of Western approaches on November 17, 1942, proved an aggressive and innovative leader who pushed his escort commanders to take the offensive against submarines rather than merely defending convoys passively. Horton himself had commanded submarines in the First World War, sinking German warships in the Baltic. He understood how submariners thought and used that knowledge to develop tactics that kept them on the defensive. Horton organized support groups, fast escort formations that could reinforce threatened convoys or pursue contacts to destruction rather than breaking off when submarines escaped temporarily. Captain Frederick John Walker led the second support group with particular aggression and success. His ships hunted submarines to exhaustion, keeping them submerged until their batteries died and they had to surface into waiting guns. Walker's tactics were demanding on men and machinery, but they produced results. Under his direct command, the second support group sank approximately 20 U-boats, the highest tally achieved by any Allied anti-submarine commander. These commanders, working in close cooperation despite service rivalries that had paralyzed earlier efforts, transformed Allied anti-submarine warfare in a matter of months. All these developments converged in the spring of 1943. The result was catastrophic for Germany. The convoy battles of March through May told the story with brutal clarity. In mid-March, two convoys designated HX-229 and SC-122 were crossing the Atlantic simultaneously when German intelligence detected their presence. Doenitz concentrated 3 wolf packs, totaling 38 submarines against them, the largest force ever assembled against North Atlantic convoys. Over 4 days, from March 16th through 19th, the wolf packs sank 22 merchant ships while losing only 1 submarine. It appeared to be another triumphant demonstration of submarine warfare at its most effective. But it was the last major German victory of the campaign. Something fundamental had changed, though the Germans did not yet recognize it. 6 weeks later, convoy ONS-5 departed Liverpool bound for Halifax, with 43 merchant ships and an escort of 7 warships under Commander Peter Gretton in the destroyer Duncan. German intelligence again detected the convoy and vectored submarines to intercept. What followed became one of the most significant naval battles of the war. For 9 days, from April 28th through May 6th, the escorts and wolf packs fought across the North Atlantic in deteriorating weather. Storms scattered the convoy. Ships struggled through mountainous seas that made submarine operations nearly impossible and strained the escorts to their limits. Gretton himself had to detach to Street Johns for fuel on May 3rd, missing the climactic engagement that would follow. His senior officer, Lieutenant Commander Robert Sherwood in the frigate Tay, took command. 13 merchant ships were lost during the extended battle, but the escorts and aircraft destroyed 7 U-boats in a series of engagements that demonstrated the new lethality of Allied anti-submarine warfare. The exchange rate had shifted decisively. Where once Germany lost 1 submarine for every 20 or 30 ships sunk, now the ratio approached 1 to 2. This was unsustainable for the U-boat arm. The following convoy battle removed all doubt that a fundamental transformation had occurred. SC-130 departed Halifax in mid-May with 37 merchant ships. Commander Peter Gretton was back in command of the escort with his B-7 escort group reinforced by additional warships. Wolf packs attacked repeatedly over several days. The escorts and aircraft responded with coordinated aggression. Not a single merchant ship was lost. All 37 reached Liverpool safely. The escorts and aircraft sank 5 submarines, including Unine 5-4. Aboard that boat was Lieutenant Peter Doenitz, the Admiral's youngest son, serving as a watch officer on his first war patrol. He died with all 46 of his crewmates on May 19th when HMS Jed and HMS Sennen attacked the submarine. A year later, on May 13th, 1944, Karl Doenitz lost his other son, Klaus, killed when torpedo boat. Saône 4-1 was sunk by the French destroyer La Combattante during an E-boat raid on Selsey. Klaus died on his 24th birthday. In the span of 12 months, the architect of the U-boat campaign lost both his sons to the war he had helped design. The statistics for May 1943 were devastating for Germany. 41 U-boats were lost in combat during that single month, with 2 more lost to accidents, bringing the total to 43. This represented approximately 25% of the operational submarine fleet destroyed in 31 days. Allied shipping losses dropped to 58 ships, totaling approximately 300,000 tons, a fraction of the March figures. The exchange rate had completely reversed. The reversal seemed almost miraculous to Allied commanders who had faced such dark prospects just weeks earlier. In March, they had watched convoys decimated and wondered if the campaign could continue. In May, they watched submarines die in unprecedented numbers and finally believed that victory was possible. German submariners experienced the change from the opposite perspective. Boats that sortied confidently in March found themselves hunted mercilessly in May. Aircraft appeared from nowhere. Escorts seemed to anticipate every move. Weapons struck with accuracy that had not existed before. Boats that dove to escape were sometimes tracked for hours and depth-charged systematically until they either surfaced or died in the deep. The psychological impact on surviving crews was severe. Many veterans who had survived dozens of patrols refused to go out again. On May 24, 1943, Doenitz ordered his submarines to withdraw from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The decision acknowledged a fundamental change in the balance of the campaign. German submariners called it Black May. We had lost the Battle of the Atlantic, Doenitz would later admit in his memoirs. The admission came reluctantly. For months afterward, he attempted to restore the submarine offensive, sending boats back into the Atlantic equipped with improved anti-aircraft weapons and radar warning devices. The results confirmed that the fundamental balance had shifted permanently. Submarines operating in the Atlantic after May 1943 faced attrition rates that no military force could sustain. Each patrol became a probability calculation, with odds heavily weighted toward death. Crews that had once volunteered enthusiastically now sailed with fatalism or outright dread. The submarine arm that had been celebrated as Germany's elite naval force became a repository for men with few other options. The reversal was comprehensive and permanent. In 1942, U-boats had sunk more than 6 million tons of Allied shipping. In 1944, they would sink less than 800,000 tons, while losing approximately 240 submarines. The hunters had become the hunted. Submarines that sortied from French ports faced near-certain death. What explained this transformation? The answer lay not in any single factor, but in the convergence of multiple advantages that the Germans had failed to anticipate and could not counter. American industrial production exceeded all German projections. Doenitz had believed that submarine warfare could prevent meaningful American participation in the European war by sinking supplies faster than they could cross the Atlantic. Instead, American shipyards produced cargo capacity faster than his submarines could destroy it. The tonnage war arithmetic that had seemed so favorable reversed completely. Germany was killing sailors, but the supplies kept flowing and the flow kept increasing. Allied technology advanced faster than German countermeasures. Centimetric radar, improved depth charges, Hedgehog, Huff-Duff, Leigh Lights, and very long-range aircraft combined to make submarine operations increasingly suicidal. The Germans developed responses to each innovation but always arrived too late. When they finally fielded a radar detector for centimetric wavelengths, Allied aircraft were already using even shorter wavelengths that the new detector could not find. Ultra-intelligence gave the Allies invisible advantages throughout the campaign. Convoys routed away from submarine patrol lines, avoided interception entirely. Hunter groups, directed by decrypted communications, caught submarines in unfavorable positions. The Germans suspected late in the war that their communications might be compromised, but could not abandon the Enigma system upon which their entire command structure depended. Institutional adaptability separated the two sides as decisively as technology. When something failed, the Allies learned and adjusted quickly. The American coastal defense disasters of early 1942 led to immediate implementation of convoy systems and improved coordination between services. German responses to setbacks tended toward doubling down on existing approaches rather than fundamental reconsideration. Germany's strategic failures ran deeper than mere miscalculation. The Z-plan that Hitler approved in January 1939 prioritized surface ship construction over submarines. Doenitz had requested 300 operational U-boats by the start of any war with Britain. He believed this was the minimum force necessary to implement the tonnage war strategy successfully. When war came in September 1939, he had only 57 submarines, and of those, only about half could be at sea at any given time, while the others underwent maintenance and transit. The construction program accelerated during the war, but the 300-boat fleet that Doenitz considered essential did not materialize until 1942 and 1943, precisely when Allied countermeasures had developed to the point where mass U-boat deployment became suicidal. Had Germany begun the war with adequate submarine strength, the early advantages might have been exploited more thoroughly before the Allies could respond. The Germans also failed to develop their own advanced submarine technology in time. The Type 21 Electroboot represented a genuine leap forward in submarine design. With underwater speed of 17 knots that exceeded most escort vessels and the ability to remain submerged for days using snorkel equipment. Had it entered service in quantity by 1943, it might have restored the submarine advantage. Instead, Allied bombing disrupted production, prefabricated hull sections did not fit together properly, and training programs could not keep pace with the new technology. Only 2 Type 21s completed war patrols, and neither fired a torpedo in anger. The revolutionary design arrived too late to affect the outcome. Doenitz never abandoned hope that new technology might reverse the verdict of Black May. He ordered submarines back into the Atlantic repeatedly throughout 1943 and 1944, equipping them with improved anti-aircraft armament, radar warning receivers, and acoustic torpedoes designed to home on escort propeller noise. None of these measures restored the balance. Each offensive cost more submarines than it destroyed Allied shipping. The arithmetic that had once favored Germany now worked inexorably against it. The human cost of this campaign reached staggering proportions. Of the approximately 40,000 men who served in German U-boats during the war, roughly 28,000 died. The 70% casualty rate was the highest of any branch of any armed force in any nation during the conflict. Some 5,000 more became prisoners of war. Only a small fraction survived the war both alive and free. The fates of the great U-boat aces illustrated the campaign's trajectory. Otto Kretschmer, the highest-scoring submarine commander of the war, with 273,000 tons sunk across 46 ships. It was captured on March 17, 1941, when his U-99 was depth-charged and forced to surface during an attack on convoy HX-112. He spent the rest of the war in Canadian prisoner camps, surviving to die on August 5, 1998. Gwenther Prian, who had won fame sinking the Royal Oak at Scapa Flow, disappeared on March 7, 1941, during an attack on convoy OB-293. His U-47 was lost with all hands. The exact cause remains uncertain. His death was kept secret by the German propaganda ministry for months. Joachim Schepke died the same night Kretschmer was captured, commanding U-100 against the same convoy. His submarine was depth-charged and forced to surface, then rammed by the destroyer Vanoc. Schepke was crushed against the periscope standards and went down with his boat. The loss of two of Germany's top three aces in a single convoy battle should have warned Doenitz of changing fortunes, but he attributed the setbacks to bad luck rather than systemic shifts. Wolfgang Leuth survived longer than most. He sank 46 merchant ships, totaling over 225,000 tons, and received the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds, one of only 7 naval officers to achieve that distinction. He survived the war, only to be shot by a German sentry on the night of May 13 and 14, 1945, at the Naval Academy near Flensburg. He had failed to respond to the sentry's challenge, and the young soldier fired as trained. Leuth received the last state funeral of the Third Reich, with Doenitz himself delivering the eulogy. Of the 859 German submarines that conducted war patrols, 648 were lost. 429 of those losses yielded no survivors at all. The crews simply vanished beneath the waves without trace. Their boats imploded at depth or burned on the surface, or simply disappeared with causes never determined. 215 submarines were lost on their very first patrol, their crews killed before gaining any combat experience. Captain Frederick John Walker of the Royal Navy became the most successful U-boat hunter of the war. His tactical innovations and relentless pursuit of submarines made his second support group legendary among convoy escorts. Walker developed aggressive tactics that kept submarines on the defensive and pressed attacks to destruction rather than breaking off when submarines escaped temporarily. He drove himself relentlessly, spending weeks at sea in continuous operations. On July 9, 1944, he died of cerebral thrombosis brought on by exhaustion. The battle had simply worn him out before he could see final victory. The war at sea killed approximately 30,000 British merchant seamen and over 9,000 American merchant mariners. These civilian sailors faced dangers comparable to combat troops, while often receiving less recognition and fewer protections under international law. They kept sailing despite knowing that submarine attack might come at any moment, that their ships might burn or explode or simply sink beneath them in minutes. Without their willingness to continue sailing, no amount of military success would have mattered. Doenitz himself survived the war to become briefly the final leader of Nazi Germany following Hitler's suicide, then faced the Nuremberg Tribunal, where he received a 10-year sentence for war crimes related to unrestricted submarine warfare. Upon release, he lived quietly in Almuele near Hamburg until December 1980. Never fully accepting that his strategy had been fundamentally flawed rather than merely overwhelmed by circumstances. The last great commander of the Happy Time era, Reinhard Hardigan, outlived nearly everyone else connected to the campaign. He survived to age 105, dying on June 9, 2018 in Bremen. He had made peace with former enemies, participating in memorial ceremonies with survivors of ships he had sunk and corresponding with families of those who died. Time eventually softened the hatreds that had burned so intensely during the war. One U-boat escaped destruction to become a permanent monument. On June 4, 1944, just 2 days before D-Day, a hunter-killer group led by Captain Daniel Gallery, aboard the escort carrier Guadalcanal, forced U-505 to the surface west of Africa. Lieutenant Junior Grade Albert David led a 9-man boarding party that reached the submarine and prevented the crew from completing scuttling procedures. David received the only Medal of Honor awarded in the Atlantic Theatre. He died of a heart attack on September 17, 1945, before the medal could be formally presented. The captured submarine was towed across the Atlantic and eventually became an exhibit at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, where visitors can walk through its compartments today. The Battle of the Atlantic lasted from September 1939 to May 1945. Its outcome determined whether everything else was possible. Without the supplies that crossed those contested waters, Britain could not have held out. Without safe passage for American troops and equipment, no invasion of Europe could have been mounted. The great land campaigns from Normandy to Berlin, the liberation of Western Europe, the final destruction of Nazi Germany, all depended upon victory at sea first. The scale of the Allied build-up that followed victory in the Atlantic defied imagination. By the spring of 1944, over 1.5 million American soldiers had crossed the ocean safely to staging areas in Britain. Millions of tons of equipment, ammunition, fuel and supplies accompanied them. The invasion fleet that assembled for D-Day included over 5,000 ships of all types. None of this would have been possible had the U-boats maintained their stranglehold on the Atlantic shipping lanes. Churchill understood this dependency instinctively. He devoted more attention to the Atlantic battle than to any other single aspect of the war because he recognized that everything else hinged upon it. The bomber offensive required fuel and spare parts from America. The Mediterranean campaigns required reinforcements and supplies crossing the Atlantic. The eventual liberation of Western Europe required millions of American soldiers transported safely across waters that German submarines had once dominated. By June 1944, that crossing had become routine rather than perilous. The German submarine fleet came closer to winning the war than almost any other Axis force. The crisis of March 1943 represented a genuine turning point, when Allied shipping losses exceeded replacement capacity and strategic reserves were depleting rapidly. Had that situation continued for several more months, the consequences would have been severe. But it did not continue. The multiple strands of Allied response converged in those critical weeks. Intelligence from Ultra directed evasive routing and offensive operations. New technology eliminated the submarine's previous advantages. Industrial production overwhelmed the arithmetic of the tonnage war. Tactical innovations made each encounter more dangerous for the submarine than the surface ship. The campaign that had seemed destined to strangle Britain instead became a graveyard for German submarines and the young men who crewed them. The men who fought this campaign on both sides demonstrated extraordinary courage under circumstances of extreme danger and physical misery. Submarine crews lived in cramped steel cylinders, breathing fouled air, never knowing when the next depth charge might crush their boat. Merchant seamen sailed knowing that torpedo attack might come without warning, that survival in the frigid North Atlantic measured in minutes rather than hours. Escort crews worked to exhaustion, protecting convoys across thousands of miles of hostile ocean. Many never came home. Their sacrifice shaped the world that emerged from the war. The supplies that reached Britain kept democracy alive in Western Europe during the darkest years when Nazi conquest seemed inevitable. The food that arrived prevented starvation. The fuel that arrived kept aircraft flying and tanks moving. The weapons and ammunition that arrived gave defenders the means to resist until the tide finally turned. The lessons learned about convoy operations, anti-submarine warfare, and intelligence cooperation influenced naval thinking for generations afterward. The importance of air power in maritime operations became established doctrine in every major navy. The value of integrated intelligence and operations proved itself conclusively on the greatest scale ever attempted. The necessity of technological adaptation and institutional flexibility distinguished winners from losers in this most demanding of campaigns. If you found this story compelling, we hope you will take a moment to like this video and share it with others who appreciate military history. Subscribe to our channel to discover more untold stories of the Second World War. Leave us a comment and let us know where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, connected by a shared fascination with the past. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. These stories matter because the people who lived them mattered, and their courage deserves recognition. Every ship that made port safely, every submarine that did not return, every sailor who faced the Atlantic's fury and the enemy's weapons, they deserve to be remembered accurately for what they actually did and what they actually endured. The Battle of the Atlantic was won on those grey waters by people whose collective effort changed history.